TSOs and DSOs need to interact very intensively on the data exchange to make sure that the grid as a whole, both at transmission level and distribution level, is stable, reliable, and safe.
2050. That's the year by which Europe aims to become climate neutral. To achieve this, the transmission and distribution networks urgently need to be expanded or modernized. They have to integrate a rapidly growing number of decentralized renewable energy resources and exchange electricity across national borders, because that's the only way to ensure we have a resilient, sustainable, and affordable energy supply. So what role do digital technologies play in making the grid smarter and more efficient? And what role could a digital twin for the European power grid play in enabling innovative solutions and coordinated investments? We'll find out in this episode.
Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized, and digital, bringing together electricity, heat, and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there.
My guest today has a long track record in leadership positions in the infrastructure area. Lastly, being the CEO of Enexis, a leading Dutch distribution system operator. Now he's moved on to be the Secretary General of the newly established EU DSO Entity. Mandated by EU regulation, DSO Entity unites over 900 European DSOs and provides them with all necessary services. Very happy to have him on the podcast. Welcome, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Zach, and ready to start.
Well, Peter, you worked for Enexis in your last position, I think, which has more or less 5,000 people. Now you moved on to DSO Entity. Did you have to move to Brussels? And I think suddenly you have a team of maybe 2 or 3 people. Is that right? Any adjustments you had to take in order to be comfortable in your new role?
Oh yeah, I feel very comfortable, but indeed it is quite a change. So I work most of the time from Brussels. And indeed, running a startup company is quite different from managing a well-established large company. But it gives a lot of positive energy since it gives us the challenge and the opportunity to serve all DSOs throughout Europe to facilitate energy transition. It's a big step, but a very nice step.
You know what's really interesting to say? Because you said it feels like a startup. Yet you're in Brussels working with regulatory issues, which usually is very much anything but agile. So how well can you balance both, like being a very small team, being able to work very agile, but in the regulatory space where things usually take a lot of time and a lot of cycles and everybody needs to be involved?
Yes, that's a very nice question. And obviously the pace of developments can differ. But I think from the urgency of energy transition, you see things move much faster than before. So that is also our challenge, to try to move it faster and also to pick the right priorities, right? So we do not need to work on everything at the same time. But if we pick the right priorities, we make a good acceleration towards the right direction for a sustainable energy system.
Well, talking about priorities, if we look at the European power grids for the energy transitions, in which areas is there need for action? So what are the top priorities you need to focus on?
Yeah, that is a very good choice to be made on what priorities to select. And before I go there, perhaps a very brief introduction on what the distribution system operators, DSOs, are doing for their business. Because if you look at the energy system as a whole, together with the transmission system operators, we form the system to distribute electricity, but also to facilitate the market. And DSOs are the last mile to the consumer. So through our 900 members, we serve 250 million consumers throughout Europe to get their energy safely, reliably, and efficiently. Now, and if you look for the developments for the future that are determining the direction for priorities, I think we can all easily see that electrification gives a lot of pressure on the electric grid, and also that the variability of the renewable resources gives certain priorities that are different from history. And to illustrate that a little bit more, to make the grid future-proof, it is important that we expand the grid, simply because we have more traffic on the grid through electrification. But also we need to change the system from a one-way grid into a two-way grid, because most of the renewable resources will be injected in the grid at the distribution level, up to 70%. So we need to anticipate a two-way system, including the facilitation of flexibility mechanisms. So therefore, we do not only need to expand the grid, but also to smarten it, so as to enable consumers to play their part from the position in the grid.
So that very much sounds like a technical issue in the first place.
Yes, I think there is a lot of technical issues involved about expanding, about technology and all things. But like I said, we are not only distributing energy, we are also facilitating the market. So also from the regulation and the market signals and market development, it's important that we find new priorities and take good direction. How, for instance, to facilitate flexibility to serve as a real market, so that we do not arrange everything through the grid technically, but also that the market and the consumers that are prosumers can play their part and enable the integration of renewable sources in the future.
So if I paraphrase it, I heard 4 priorities already. That's expansion, that's integrating the two-way thinking, that's digitalization and flexibility. So if we focus on the digitalization, why is that so crucial?
Yeah, I think digitalization comes together with the smartening of the grid. Like I already said, we need to expand the capacity by just growing the grid, but we also need to make more efficient use of the grid capacity. And there are 2 reasons for that. It is the more intense energy use, and it is the variability of the renewable sources. I think we are all aware that wind and solar are vary over the day, over the seasons. So, and that is what we need to accommodate. Now, to accommodate that, it's important that we have better visibility on the grid and a better means to predict and operate the grid, anticipating the variability both in use and in supply. So that is why digitization is important.
Now, you mentioned that actually it's important that DSO and the transmission system operators are working together. That means on an association or organization level, DSO Entity works together with ENTSO-E, the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity, to jointly develop a digital twin of the European power grid. Can you explain us why we need a digital twin and what it is? And maybe just before, is the ENTSO-E sort of like the equivalent to the DSO entity just for transmission system operators?
Yes, thank you. That is a good observation indeed. DSO Entity and ENTSO-E are 2 of a kind. So in fact, we are partners together developing the regulation of the future, obviously closely interacting with other institutions like the European Commission and ACER, the Agency of Regulators. But indeed, we operate a lot together, and we always try to take an integrated view for the system.
Coming back to the digital twin, what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, the digital twin, I think, has been used very often as an example to illustrate the digitization and especially the further operation of the grid in the future. The objective of digital twin, I would say, is to improve the modeling of the grid so as to take better decisions on investments and better decisions on operation. And in fact, what it is simply a virtual representation of the grid. You can say a virtual model. And it can have various levels of development, like functionality levels or visibility levels or scope levels. And I think it's very important that in the project that we are now developing, that we take a close look into the required functionality, so that we design the digital twin such that it can really serve the purposes that we try to serve with it and achieve the objectives defined by the European Commission.
So you're still in the early stages of planning. So once completed, which areas will the digital twin cover? Just the transmission grid, so also the entire distribution grid?
Yes, that will also depend on the dimensions that we look at. In essence, it could cover all grid levels from TSO and DSO. However, I think we also need to take a close look, like I said before, on the required functionality. And I can imagine that for TSOs, having a cross-border European-wide grid, it's very important that you model all cross-border lines and the main land lines in one model. For DSOs that have a more regional structure, it might be helpful to look for the right granularity. So perhaps it's not necessary to design a model for 250 million connections, but perhaps we can already serve the purposes that we have identified by having it on a more regional level, or to have a sort of modeling approach that allows for a stepwise development over time. So I think for now we have a vision, but it needs to be further elaborated before we can give a clear definition of the final product.
Now, to be honest, I probably could imagine it to be fairly easy to set it up for the transmission part. But if I imagine over 900 DSOs coming together, and a lot of them coming from Germany, where, let's be honest, we're very far behind when it comes, for example, to smart meters, how realistic is it really to get together this huge patchwork all over Europe and to get the data and the insights and the visibility?
Yeah. Let's go back again also to the definition of a digital twin on that, because digital twin can focus on modeling the grid. Another definition would be that you also look at the layer of data exchange. So it's not a model only. I think it's also much related to the data exchange between TSO and DSO, and between DSOs as such, also including the consumer and the market. So it's not necessary perhaps to have a fully covering model, like I said, to cover all DSOs throughout Europe for 250 million consumers. But I think that looking at relevant market areas or looking at relevant regional zones, you can already start with exchanging the relevant data, and then perhaps through a stepwise development can look for next levels or next layers in the model. So a modular approach might be more appropriate for the DSOs there.
So if I also repeat it in my own words, actually, and I guess that's the misconception I had here, is it's not necessarily a real-time data insight, but it's a model using comparative data, etc., where no real-time data is available.
Yeah, I think to make it a bit complicated, I think both visions are right. So the initial first step could be that it's not exactly real time, but that is a modeling exercise that helps to take better decisions. A next level could be that it is real time, so that you can take your operational decisions based on real time data. And then another next level could be to make it predictive, right? So you can even use it to analyze scenarios. And that is in fact what I mean with a modular approach. You can go various steps, grow the functionality of the model, and expand also the scope of the model.
Now, you mentioned 3 different levels, for example. What sort of timeline would you attach to each of these levels, or the project general?
Yeah, I think that will also depend on the way we go forward with, for instance, the interaction with other European programs. You might be aware of the Horizon Europe project schemes, and for instance, now there's an interesting call for various market parties to make further designs for the virtual grid model, the digital twin. Another important stepping stone, I think, is work done already. I'm aware, for instance, in Germany, that there is the Comenius project, and I think we could make use of that. And apart from that, for the timeline, I think it's also important to distinguish between the 2 tracks of the program. Perhaps I may elaborate on that, because we have discussed the digital twin, but there is another track that is the development of smart grid indicators. And they are focused to design indicators that help DSOs and TSOs to take decisions to invest in the smartening of the grid. And that's important, because you can only build the fully functional digital twin if the grid itself is also smart. So it needs to go in parallel, the development of the digital twin and the smartening of the grid.
So it's also an approach to see where investments are needed and to send it into the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. And for that, especially the smart grid indicators are relevant. They will consist of a limited set, and they will cover both input and output indicators. So the input indicators will help to direct investments in the right direction. And the output indicators will show the benefits of the smartening of the grid and therefore also deliver new input for the digital twin to be further developed.
Now, you already mentioned benefits. What kind of benefits could we expect from the digital twin?
Yeah, I think if you look to the benefits for the longer term, in fact, there are 5 areas to cover. So let me try to briefly elaborate on it without making it too long. But a very important area to cover is the observability of the grid. We also call it the visibility. What is going on in the grid, and do we need to take any measure to compensate that? Another important area to cover is the better decision making on investments. Not only when to invest in smartening of the grid, but also where. Because from the capacity utilization, we can better analyze the necessity of investments in certain regions. I think it's also helpful, third point, to be more resilient, because if we have better grid modeling, we can also better monitor and fight, for instance, cybersecurity attacks, or if an attack occurs, restore quickly. Fourth area would be that at the next level, we can be active systems managers. So if we have better visibility of the grid, we can operate the grid more efficiently. And lastly, not to forget, TSOs and DSOs need to interact very intensively on the data exchange to make sure that the grid as a whole, both at transmission level and distribution level, is stable, reliable, and safe.
Now, earlier you already mentioned the smart grid indicators, and you mentioned it as a tool also to divert investment, or not divert investment, but to channel investment in the right direction. How could the grid operators themselves profit from smart grid indicators?
Yeah, I think that the smart grid indicators are a helpful guide for investment decisions, but I think also that there is another area of interaction needed, that is the interaction with the regulator. So developing smart grid indicators is also very interactive with the regulator, who needs to judge the efficiency of investments. So I think having a European-wide limited set of indicators could help both DSOs and regulators to take control of their investments for the future.
Well, Peter, we already really went deep down the rabbit hole in explaining the whole concept of the digital twin all across the European grid landscape. Now, to close up, we started with you saying that it feels like running a startup. Startups have themselves very short timelines until they reach their next objective. What's the next objective for you that DSO Entity wants to reach? What's your next milestone?
Yeah, we have milestones in the near future and in the further future. Let me start with our mission, because really we think that DSOs are at the heart of energy transition, and it is our mission to enable DSOs throughout Europe to facilitate that. But our more nearby goals are to develop those tools and conditions that are necessary to guide decisions and to guide the developments. One of them is the digital twin, but I think closely related to the developments in the future is also the network code for flexibility. And that is the network code we are actually working on, and that I think a lot of people are aware of. So the year 2023 really is the year to develop the network code for flexibility as a basic fundament, a basic foundation for the future grid.
Thanks a lot, Peter. It's been really exciting having you on the podcast. Thanks a lot for these great explanations, and all the best for the next goals in 2023.
Thank you very much, and at your service. See you soon.
See you soon. For further information, visit EM Power Europe, the international exhibition for energy management and integrated energy solutions. It is focused on modernizing and digitalizing the power grid into a smart grid, covering a range of topics such as injecting flexibility and integrating prosumers, e-mobility, as well as power-to-heat concepts into a holistic, renewable energy system. Learn more online at em-power.eu.